that we kind of share in common with our thinking. Lewis's particular work, I won't go into it too much, I'll let him do it, but it's, in the main, it's to do with universal design theory, and he'll talk a little bit about that after I've talked to you. So I know that I've spoken to some of you before, and you're familiar with my perambulographer, and so I'm going to talk a bit about that today and where that's led me. But before I do, I need to mention really where it all started. And there's two things to mention. The first is a kind of a sense of, it was about a sense of identity, about where I'm from and who I am. And in the main, this comes from the fact that I grew up with my grandpa. He was a dialect speaker, Cheshire dialect. We lived in a rural location. And that is a very different kind of life to somebody perhaps who lives in Chester and speaks received pronunciation and standard English. Of course, which is what I'm trying to do now, because if I spoke dialect it wouldn't really make much sense. But my grandpa had a really sort of fundamental impact on the way that I think about things. That's the first thing. The second thing that started it was when I wrote a song called Sparrows on the Roof. Some of you will be familiar with this, Abed certainly is. It was my song. It was a song I wrote for Palestine because of experiences there and because I find that this is the way that I know the world. Music and songwriting is the way that I understand the world, it's the way that I analyse the world, it's the way that I research, quite frankly. So Sparrows on the Roof was my way of coming to terms with what I experienced in Palestine in a way that I could share that experience. I'm not going to share it with you now, but it's just that, because crucially that song is about place and the politics that can be associated to place, and that's something that I think permeates most of my work. So this is the perambulographer. Okay, that I made.
Just about to go. My first outing with the perambulographer.
This is my house, and this is Bickerton Hill near my house.
Bickerton Hill. I'll make those snaps off.
This is my first time of using it. So you turn this lever, and it makes the paper move on the page so that you can draw simultaneously as you walk. And the idea with this was to try and appreciate, have a direct connection with the landscape, with place, again. So the place is really, as I say, it features a lot. And I wanted to try and understand how I can compose in a different way than people often compose about place and about my identity and also about community and belonging and things. So this was the device that I sort of made to try and do that. The paper then was used as a graphic notation. That was the notation that I then used to write the song. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll just very quickly play a snippet of the song, the final product. This is the process, just the final product, just so you have an idea of what it sort of sounds like. But what I'll mention though is that the first bit you're about to hear has my grandpa's voice on it. It's the only bit of the composition, apart from birdsong, that isn't me. And I don't mean that in an egotistical way, but it's just so that you're aware that the composition is completely choral, it's completely by voice. It was quite lucky actually that I captured my grandpa. My grandpa died some years ago, but I was quite lucky that I captured this little bit of his voice, because it was when I was 15 years old and I'd written a song. I think it was about a girlfriend or someone I fancied at school, and I gave it my grandpa on a tape to listen to, and he took it round to his girlfriend's house, and there's another lady there called Hilda, and instead of pressing play they pressed record by accident. So yes, it did record over a bit of my song, but the brilliant thing is I have them reacting to the fact that I gave them a song, and it's lovely. I treasure it. I love this little bit of recording because it's accident, but it's my grandpa speaking, and you can hear him a little bit anyway. So So it starts with a recording of me running around my garden chasing bees with a microphone. Okay, and then it goes into this drone, which I'm going to speak about a little bit more right at the end. So as I've explained, so my composition was made by voice. It was an interpretation of a graphic score that I'd made using this perambulographer, as I call it. Okay? So just a little bit about the theory behind this and where I'm coming from, my positionality. There's a folklorist called Brunvant, and some years ago he talked about the idea that culture, as we know it, can be differentiated into three different types. You have the elite culture, so the discourse of the powerful. You have the popular culture, you know, so in music terms, think the top 10 hits of a country, or what you turn on to a popular radio station, you know, that's popular music. And also you have folk culture, which tends, there's arguments, but people tend to think of that as orally transmitted. It's made by everyday people, this culture, and it's about everyday life. And you know, folk culture, everybody has folk culture, incidentally. But there are these three different types of culture, is the idea, and they each have their own tradition as well. The interesting point though here, and this is how I'd like to sort of offer a different intercultural understanding of culture, is that we don't just live in one particular type of culture. We kind of inhabit them all. So sometimes we do something which sits within folk culture. So a good example, you know, Sleeping Beauty, the traditional tale. Okay, maybe not everybody, but bear with me. It's a traditional tale because it was told orally, so that's folk culture. Then the Brothers Grimm came along as scholars and wrote it down, and then it becomes elite culture in that format. And then and then people start to read it and talk about it. It's passed into popular culture, and then children learn about it from the books and they act it out in school. It becomes folk culture again. So the point here is that these modes of culture are you know, you can traverse them, you move between them. We're never ever just one thing. And that's a really important part of Brunvant's theory. Now for me, I think that folk culture is perhaps the most democratising of cultures as well. Okay. Oops, what have I done? Okay, so further to this, I should mention that this is about, for me, this is about music pedagogy as well, and how we all learn music. Now, in the UK and the US at the moment, there's a writer called Lucy Green who's very, very popular. So much so that her theory of teaching music can be found in quite a lot of high schools, for example, across the country. And her idea is that a way of teaching music through popular music is a good idea. We can get the kids interested, children interested, if we use popular culture. So she looks at how popular musicians learn. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's actually, I think it's a really, really interesting pedagogy. I think it's a really good pedagogy. It's helped a lot. But my criticism would be that she misunderstands folk culture to such a degree that it's actually detrimental to her pedagogy. So that's the kind of background, if you will, the sort of literature background to the research. Oh, why does it keep doing that? Okay. So this is me on my walk again. Just, I stopped at a hedge. I don't know why I stopped, but I did.
Part of the environment, isn't it? But not like houses. Houses aren't part of the environment. So not too much. Maybe it's pretty agricultural. Maybe that's like somehow in my head. That belongs here.
Okay, so I get to a really crucial point now in my study and my thinking, because I use the word belongs, belong, and that really is quite important to me, as it turns out, as I moved through my thinking. You'll notice these videos are really important too, because it was an immediate reflection as I was going along. I was able to think, what am I doing this? Why am I stopping and drawing this as it happened, as the moments happen? The next video I'll show you in a moment, though, is of there's a gate just to the left of this shot here, and this consumes me. This gate absolutely consumes me. I don't know why it was so important, and then one day, boom, I realised. I'll explain as we go. Okay. Before I do, though, I need to mention another theorist, and this theorist is called Bausinger. And he was a really eminent folklorist in the 50s and 60s. And he changed the paradigm of folklore massively, because at the time people were going out into rural communities and collecting stories from old people. That's pretty standard folkloric practice. But Bausinger said, hang on, whoa. We live in an industrial world now, and we need to think about how folk and folklore operate within, and how they function, how folklore functions within this new world. Because the folklore is still there, it's different though, and we need to try and understand that. So he made this really big shift. And that's important to me, because personally I think we need to think about how we live now in the digital world, and how folk culture works in the digital world. So that's another sort of aspect that I think is important. The way Bausinger did this was he took three different ideas. He took the idea of spatial horizons, temporal horizons, and social horizons. What he means by that is the horizon is what you know, what's in your world. So an example, spatial horizon. 300 years ago, your spatial horizon might have just been the next village, because you might not really have gone past that hill. Ooh, there'd be monsters. But nowadays, our spatial horizon is completely different, because we can go online, and we can connect with somebody in Cambodia, Australia and Peru at the same time. So our folk culture is influenced by the expansion of our spatial horizon. This was quite revolutionary, because people at the time when Bausinger was writing were thinking that folk culture was shrinking, that we were losing folk culture. And it's still the case actually in a lot of people's minds. We think we're losing folk culture. On the contrary, if you take Bausinger's paradigm as read, folk culture is expanding massively and exponentially with digital culture. So I decided to use the social, the spatial and the temporal, so time, as a kind of structuring to my thinking, and it was really useful because of this gate that I told you about. So I'm about to, so this is, I'll explain. See by the side of it, both the other like the whole from here, and next to it down. This just become this huge was one meters. I don't know if you could hear what I was saying there. Did it come clear? Okay, so basically, you can see, you've got the trees here, and there's actually there's tree stumps here as well, and the ground is actually bowed like that. It has a sort of bow in the ground. Now usually, if you find something like that in a landscape, it's what we call in England a holloway, or holweg, or holveg, or holway, hollyway, holyway, and they're normally very ancient paths. So at some time, or for centuries, this was a path that was used over and over again for a really, really long time. Now, It's not really used much now, other than for people that want to get onto the Sandstone Trail, which is near my house. But I just found that really fascinating as an idea, that I was walking the same place as maybe my grandpa had walked, that maybe his grandpa had walked. And this gave me a sense of identity that I immediately connected with, and it was strange. I loved walking up this path. And it brought to mind all sorts of other sorts of theorists and ideas. One of them was Benjamin. I won't go into his sort of point right now. But the other person, the other thing it made me think of course, is all the connections to Deriving, to the flaneur, to, I don't know, people like Solnit with Wanderlust. You know, there's a whole host of literature around the idea of walking, as most of you know already, thanks to Ava. But so this was this psychogeographical element. So here comes place, but place, which is directly linked to my social belonging, to my community, and also place that is linked to time. Not just about now, maybe about the future, probably, but also about my past, all at once. And that for me was really powerful. So I mentioned Benjamin a little bit there, but there's another chap. There's a Cheshire dialect writer called Alan Garner. He lives just up the road here. And I love Garner because he writes in a very mystical, powerful way, and it kind of connects with the way that I think. And he has a notion of creativity that kind of I appreciate. And the way that I think about it is this. And this goes for composition for me. You know, when you look at the stars and you see one star, yeah, it's what, 300 million light years away? And then you look at the star next to it in that constellation, but that star next to it isn't 300 million light years away. That might be 600 million light years away. The one next to that in the constellation might be a new star, so not very old, like 20 million light years. The one next to that might be dead already, but we're still getting the light from it. The point here that I'm making is that we see those stars at once. It's a temporal vision, but we're actually seeing different times at once. And so I think of this obviously it's a constellation, but I think this is a really powerful metaphor, because we have these things in psychoanalysis and psychology called engrams. An engram is something that you remember and you think, and it reminds you of something. So if you walk down the street and you smell a perfume that your ex-partner used to wear, you smell that perfume, you think of your ex-partner. Yeah, that's an engram. That's how engrams work. If you have a loved one who dies and you feel pain because of that, the grief, the loss, that's an engram. But if 10 years later somebody else you love dies, you don't just feel the pain of that latter person, you feel the pain of everybody you've ever known and lost. And this is engrammatic. This is an emotional response. It's an engrammatic response. And think of that as like a constellation. So for me, my composition, my songwriting works as a constellation of loss. This is how I know my world. It sounds sad, but it's not. It's actually really good. I know where I belong. I know where I belong. Okay. So that's Ghana. This is, just to show you, this is near the top of the hill now. I'm not quite at the top of my hill. And I walk this path over and over again. What I decided to do to capture that idea of time was not to write on paper, but to use plastic, acetate on the perambulographer. And I took the same walk about 30 times, exactly the same walk, about 30 times. And I wrote, and I drew on acetate. So I was able to put the acetates on top of each other, and I could see them all at once.